An Eritrean perspective on the Ethiopia-Eritrea conflict. For Eritreans, the conflict with Ethiopia has never been about hatred of a neighbor. It has always been about the right of a people to exist, to govern themselves, and to decide their own destiny. Independence was not given to us as a gift. It was earned through decades of sacrifice, through a 30-year armed struggle, and through referendum observed and approved by the world. To understand the Eritrean perspective, one must seek independence not as a political option, but as a sacred promise to martyrs. Here is the historical background. Eritrea's history is different from Ethiopia's. For centuries, our coastlines were linked to the Red Sea world, shaped by trade and foreign influence. When colonial powers came, Eritrea was under Italy, then briefly under Britain, and later federated with Ethiopia by a United Nations resolution in 1952. That federation was supposed to protect Eritreans' autonomy, but Ethiopia dismantled it step by step until Eritrea was annexed in 1962. From that moment, Eritreans rose in armed resistance, fighting for 3 decades until independence in 1991. To Eritreans, the lesson of history is clear. Our freedom was denied before, and we will not allow it to be denied again. Apologies. The referendum of 1993. In 1993, Eritreans were given the chance to speak for themselves through a UN-observed referendum. The result was overwhelming. Over 99% voted for independence. It was not forced, it was not staged, it was the free choice of a people who had sacrificed for decades. Ethiopia itself accepted the result and recognized Eritrea as a sovereign nation. From the Eritrean point of view, the referendum closed the debate. Eritrea is independent, and the matter is settled in both legal and moral terms. The border war of 1998 to 2000 is remembered by Eritreans as a tragedy that should never have happened. Thousands died over territory that had already been defined in colonial treaties, and later confirmed by the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission under the Algiers Agreement. That agreement was final and binding. Yet Ethiopia refused for years to implement it. To Eritreans, this refusal was a betrayal of international law. The issue was not about land or a town like Badme. It was about principle, about whether agreements mean anything at all. Eritreans see their stance as one of legality, while Ethiopia's refusal is seen as an attempt to rewrite history. Ethiopia often argues that it is unfair for a large country of more than 120 million people to have no direct access to the sea. Eritreans respond that geography is not decided by fairness, but by history and borders. Many landlocked nations exist in the world, and they rely on trade agreements with neighbors. Eritrea does not deny Ethiopia the right to use ports, but it rejects the idea that Ethiopia has a natural claim to Eritrean territory or coastline. Sovereignty cannot be sacrificed for convenience. To Eritreans, the demand for sea access through Eritrean land sounds like a call to reopen old wounds and deny the independence for which we fought. Ethiopians sometimes raise the issue of the Afar people, who live on both sides of the Eritrean-Ethiopian border. Eritreans reply that ethnicity does not determine state boundaries. Many ethnic groups around the world live across borders, but that does not mean states should dissolve. The Afar people are part of Eritrea, just as they are part of Ethiopia and Djibouti. Respecting their rights and culture is important, but it does not erase Eritrea's sovereignty. Eritrea has often been accused of supporting Ethiopian opposition groups and armed movements. Eritreans respond that these accusations are often exaggerated and politically motivated. When Ethiopia hosted armed groups opposed to Eritrea, it was seen as normal diplomacy. Yet when Eritrea is accused, it becomes a crime. From the Eritrean perspective, the real problem is not support for opposition, but Ethiopia's own unwillingness to accept internal diversity and dissent. Eritreans also note Ethiopia's shifting alliances at different times. Ethiopia has allied with Sudan, Egypt, and Somalia against Eritrea. To Eritreans, this shows a pattern. Ethiopia seeks to isolate Eritrea diplomatically rather than build a genuine partnership. Eritrea, meanwhile, has always sought respect for sovereignty and independence, whether dealing with neighbors or global powers. Ethiopians sometimes accuse Eritrea of holding them hostage by controlling access to the Red Sea. Eritreans reject this idea. They argue that ports are services, not gifts, and Ethiopia can access them through agreements, just as it used Djibouti's ports for years. So Eritrea is not a chokehold. To all Eritrea, a chokehold is to deny Eritrea's independence and demand rights that no neighbors can accept. The role of the United Nations. The United Nations played a role in Eritrea's history, first in creating the federation with Ethiopia, then in supervising the referendum. From the Eritrean perspective, the United Nations made mistakes in the past by failing to protect Eritrean autonomy. Yet, in 1993, the United Nations helped confirm Eritrea's independence. Eritreans argue that international law is on their side and that Ethiopia's refusal to accept binding agreements has been the real obstacle to peace. Then there is a religion and cultural question. Some raise religious differences as a point of division between Eritrea and Ethiopia. Eritreans respond that both countries are diverse, with Christians, Muslims, and other faiths living side by side. Religion is not the cause of the conflict. Politics and sovereignties are. Eritreans do not see themselves as less Ethiopian because of religion. They see themselves as Eritrean because of history, sacrifice, and choice. From the Eritrean point of view, the path forward is simple in principle, though difficult in practice. Peace requires respect. Eritrea is a sovereign nation, born of sacrifice and confirmed by law. Ethiopia is our neighbor, with whom we share history, culture, and blood. We can live together as equals, but not as master and subject. The accusations, the claims, and the demands must be set aside in favor of mutual recognition. Only then can the wounds of the past be healed and a future of cooperation built. Apologies. The following essay represents the Eritrean perspective, addressing the main issues often raised by Ethiopians and offering clear answers rooted in history, law, and principle. An Eritrea-Ethiopia alliance model. Separate but interrelated. History has often placed Eritrea and Ethiopia in conflict, but geography and culture bind them together. While independence is non-negotiable for Eritreans, the future does not have to be one of hostility. A model of alliance, separate but deeply interconnected, could honor the sacrifice of the past while offering hope for the next generations. It would be a pact of mutual respect, two nations, sovereign in law, yet united in practice by cooperation, shared security, and open exchange. This is our statement for today. I am Abebe Negash. On behalf of Ethiopian Hearts and African Hearts for Peace, I present to you the following historical precedents. The idea of being separate but not separate is not without examples. Let's see the following. Nordic Passport Union, 1954 to today. Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Iceland remain fully sovereign, but allow citizens to move, work, and live freely without passports. They also coordinate closely on defense and diplomacy. The next example is the European Union, EU, and Schengen area. Independent states with open doors, shared markets, and collective security commitments. The other example is East African Community, EAC. Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, and South Sudan allow free movement of people, have a customs union, and even discuss political federation. Next is Swiss Confederation, historic model. Originally mutual defense pact of Somali small states, which evolves into one Europe's most enduring nations. The other is Senegambia Confederation, 1982 to 1989. A cautionary tale showing that such alliance failed without equal respect and genuine partnership. So should Ethiopia and Eritrea go this route, Senegambia Confederation failure should be the perfect example. Principles of an Eritrea-Ethiopia alliance is as follows. Mutual defense. An attack on one is considered an attack on both. One for all for one. Number 2, open borders. Citizens can move, work, and trade freely between the two countries without passports, while both governments remain sovereign. 3, shared economic projects. Ports, railways, energy grids, and trade corridors managed jointly, ensuring Ethiopia's access to the sea through agreements, not claims. 4, respect for sovereignty. No interference in each other's internal politics. No support for opposition groups. 5, cultural recognition. Celebrating shared traditions while respecting distinct identities. Why we say this at Ethiopian Hearts for Peace and African Hearts for Peace? That's because of the following benefits. For Eritrea, security against isolation, economic growth through trade, and stability on its borders. For Ethiopia, reliable access to ports, reduced conflict costs, and a stronger regional position. For both peoples, freedom to travel, work, and reconnect families divided by decades of war. Such an alliance would not erase Eritrean independence or Ethiopian pride. Instead, it would transform rivalry into partnership. The blood of martyrs on both sides would be honored, not by new wars, but by building a future where sovereignty and unity coexist. Eritrea and Ethiopia could stand as a model for Africa. Two nations providing that being separate need not mean being divided. So Eritrea's independence and the historical context surrounding it provide crucial lessons for the Horn of Africa. While Ethiopia has a rich history of resisting colonial domination, there were critical missteps that shaped modern realities. Understanding these missteps, giving credit where due, and moving forward are essential for building lasting peace and prosperity. Here are Ethiopia's historical errors. 1962, forced annexation of Eritrea. Ethiopia dissolved the UN-mandated Federation of Eritrea in 1962 and annexed the territory by force. This unilateral action ignored international agreements and sparked decades of armed struggle by Eritrean people seeking self-determination. It was a legal and moral error that disregarded Eritrea's historical and colonial legacy. 1974 to 1991. The Derg period, even after the fall of Emperor Haile Selassie and the rise of the Derg, Eritreans continued their fight for independence. Ethiopia, consumed by internal turmoil and oppression under the Derg, failed to resolve the Eritrean question fairly. Eritreans' persistence during this period demonstrated the legitimacy and resilience of their claim. 1991 to 1993. Another historical error, TPLF era and the path to independence. When the TPLF-led government assumed power in Ethiopia, the independence of Eritrea was recognized. Although some Ethiopians perceived this as a national loss, this acknowledgement allowed both nations to focus on stability and development. The United Nations supervised referendum confirmed Eritrea's desire for sovereignty, aligning with international law and the principles of respecting colonial era boundaries. However, there were things that were not discussed. Even if they were discussed, they were dismissed by the late Prime Minister. United Nations and the referendum. The Eritrean independence referendum was supervised and recognized by the United Nations, confirming the Eritrean people's right to self-determination. This process ensured that the transition respected both legal frameworks and popular will. And the other is African Union principles. Here we have to mention the African Union building on OAU principles mandates respect for colonial era boundaries. This principle was critical in affirming Eritrea's sovereignty, ensuring consistency across the continent and preventing the fragmentation of African states. Meaning, currently, when Ethiopia is openly waging war, it is making another historical error. Like we said, there are positive outcomes and shared benefits. Eritrea's achievements. Independence allowed Eritrea to pursue governance, infrastructure, and development according to its own priorities. The country has established functional institutions and grown economically, demonstrating the success of sovereign self-determination. Ethiopia's gains. A stable northern border enabled Ethiopia to focus on major projects like the Grand Ethiopian Resonance Dam, GERD, and national development. Eritrea's independence, although painful for some, created a framework for regional stability that benefits both nations. So moving forward, lesson from the Horn of Africa is dwelling excessively on historical grievances only prolongs pain and hinders progress. Ethiopia and Eritrea must recognize the past, acknowledging the sacrifice and achievements of each side, and focus on building cooperative mechanisms for the future. Why Eritrea's sovereignty is just Eritrea's independence aligns with international law and African Union principles. Just as four African nations retained their colonial borders upon independence, Eritrea deserved the same recognition. Denying this sovereignty would have been inconsistent, unjust, and potentially destabilizing. A path toward cooperation is acknowledging historical errors and giving credit where it is due, is not a sign of weakness, but a foundation for mutual respect. Both nations can pursue economic, cultural, and security cooperation while respecting Eritrea's sovereignty. Mechanisms like open borders for trade, functional councils for joint infrastructure, and binding arbitration for disputes can create a framework where Eritrea and Ethiopia thrive together without conflict. In general, history shows that mistakes can be costly, but they also offer lessons. Ethiopia's annexation of Eritrea in 1962, the Derg's neglect, and the TPLF's later decision shaped the region profoundly. Recognizing these facts, respecting Eritrea's sovereignty, and fostering cooperation rather than conflict is the way forward. By moving beyond historical grievances, both nations can embrace a future of stability, development, and shared prosperity in the Horn of Africa. From a neutral, truth-seeker perspective, the goal is to raise provocative yet factual questions that challenge Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the wider international community to reflect on history, law, and responsibility. Without partnership, without partisanship, I would rather say, there is a set organized by them. Historical responsibility. Why did Ethiopia in 1962 choose to dissolve the United Nations mandated Eritrean Federation, despite Eritrea having international recognition and legal guarantees? Given the Derg's neglect of Eritrean independence aspirations, how should internal Ethiopian governance failures be acknowledged historically? How do Ethiopian leaders reconcile the TPLF's era recognition of Eritrean independence without proper discussion with the decades-long perception among some Ethiopians that Eritrea lost to secession? 2. International law and sovereignty. If other African nations under colonial rule retained their boundaries and sovereignty post-independence, why was Eritrea's sovereignty ever contested by Ethiopia? How does the principle of uti possidetis juris apply to Eritrea? And why has it been inconsistently interpreted by international actors regarding Ethiopia's claims? To what extent did the Algiers Agreement and the United Nations supervised referendum confirm the legitimacy of Eritrea's borders? And why should these decisions remain binding today? 3 is regional security and cooperation. Could Eritrea's independence have prevented further conflict in the Horn of Africa, or did it merely shift power dynamics without addressing root causes of instability? How can Ethiopia and Eritrea construct a framework where disputes over borders, trade, and access to ports are resolved peacefully without repeating past mistakes? Is it possible for both nations to share economic and security interests without compromising Eritrean sovereignty, or Ethiopian developmental goals? 4. Ethics and justice. What responsibility do Ethiopian and Eritrean leaders have to acknowledge the suffering caused by forced annexation, war, and displacement? How should credit be allocated for development achievements? Example, GERD, when Eritrean independence indirectly facilitated Ethiopia's focus on large infrastructure projects? How can the global community ensure historical wrongs are acknowledged without enabling a cycle of blame or renewed conflict? 5. Border African and global reflection. Why do some African nations respect colonial era borders while Ethiopia historically contested Eritrea's? What precedent does this set for other disputed territories in Africa? How should international actors balance the principle of non-interference with the moral obligation to uphold self-determination when past injustices are evident? Can the Horn of Africa be a model for how former colonies can reconcile historical conflicts while fostering cooperation and development and stability? These questions are provocative in a sense because they force reflection, but they are anchored in historical fact and mutually recognized events. United Nations Federation, Dark History, TPLF recognition, colonial borders, Alger Agreement, and African Union principles. We can create a comprehensive set of provocative, fact-based questions for the economic, social, cultural, and ethical dimensions of Eritrea-Ethiopian relations while showing both sides of the discussion. The goal is to make people think deeply, reflect honestly, and ask themselves the hard questions. Here is a structured draft for me. I set out, so you hear it. Economic dimension, key facts. Eritrea has its own ports and controlled maritime access, which Ethiopia historically sought. Both nations have significant infrastructure projects, Eritrea's ports and Ethiopia's GERD. Cross-border trade and migration exist informally, but formal integration is limited. Question is, how much of Ethiopia's economic planning historically depended on controlling Eritrea's ports, and was this justified legally or morally? Could Eritrea and Ethiopia have achieved mutual prosperity if cooperative economic framework had been established post-independence? Are there opportunities lost because historical disputes, like type of money they want to use, blocked cross-border investments and trade? How should wealth creation and development credit be fairly acknowledged when independence exists but sovereignty is maintained? Could Eritrean ports and Ethiopian industry be jointly managed without violating sovereignty? And now let's take a look at the social dimension of it. Key facts are communities across borders share language, religion, and kinship. Examples are the Tigrayans speak Tigrinya, so are Eritreans. And we also have Afars and others. Conflicts displaced people. In these conflicts, displaced populations and fractured families over decades. How many families are separated? How many? Eritrea's independence reshaped regional demographics. So the question is, how have historical conflicts impacted the daily lives, families, and social cohesion of people living across Eritrean Ethiopian borders? Could people maintain their social connections freely if former borders were respected but practical mobility encouraged? Are grievances amplified because historical narratives favor one side's perspective over the other? How can both nations reconcile shared social heritage with sovereign separation? The other is the cultural dimension. The fact is that Eritrea and Ethiopia share religious and cultural ties. Orthodox Christianity, Islam, Afar, and other ethnic groups. Colonization, war, and annexation disrupted cultural continuity, that's for sure. So, to what extent did colonial era and post-colonial politics distort or suppress shared cultural heritage? How should cultural achievements be celebrated without fueling nationalism or resentment? Can Eritrean and Ethiopian cultural cooperation exist while respecting political boundaries? Does the preservation of unique Eritrean identity requires strict border enforcement, or can cultural bridges exist despite national separation? Here is a legal dimension too. The United Nations mandated federation, we said that before. Algiers Agreement in 2000. African Union principles of respecting colonial borders also there. Eritrea's independence referendum supervised by the UN. Historical Ethiopian claims challenged international legal norms. So the question is, why did Ethiopia challenge internationally recognized frameworks despite clear legal precedents favoring Eritrean sovereignty? How have international actors, United Nations, African Union, West, influenced outcomes in ways that affected both nations' legal standing? Could stronger enforcement of international law have prevented decades of conflict? Are both nations equally aware of and compliant with modern international legal principles in their ongoing interaction? In all, there is ethical dimension too. Forced annexation, wars, and displacement cause deep human suffering. How ethical is this? Eritrea's struggle for self-determination was protracted and costly. Both nations have benefited indirectly from relative stability post-independence. The question is, how should Ethiopia ethically reckon with past annexation and conflict with Eritrea? Sorry. What responsibilities international actors have to ensure justice and prevent exploitation of historical grievances? Can both nations acknowledge past pain while committing to constructive coexistence? And what ethical frameworks support this? Here is our guiding principle for each dimension we discussed above. The questions are neutral, fact-based, and reflective. They invite both sides, leaders, citizens, and the international community to critically examine decisions, consequences, and possibilities without assigning partisan blame. Eritrea's independence and the historical context surrounding it provide crucial lessons for the Horn of Africa. While Ethiopia has a rich history of resisting colonial domination, there were critical missteps that shaped modern realities. Understanding these missteps, giving credit where due, and moving forward are essential for building lasting peace and prosperity. So, United Nations and the referendum, the Eritrean independence referendum was supervised, period. African Union principles honor colonial boundaries, period. So Eritrea's achievement undeniably is independence. We allowed Eritrea to pursue governance, infrastructure, and development according to its own priorities. The country has established functional institutions and grown economically, demonstrating the success of sovereign self-determination. And Ethiopia also gained, as discussed. Moving forward, like we discussed, dwelling excessively on historical grievances only prolongs pain and hinders progress. Ethiopia and Eritrea must recognize the past, acknowledge the sacrifice and achievements of each side, and focus on building cooperative mechanisms for the future. Anytime you can ask why Eritrean sovereignty is just. Eritrea's independence aligned with international law, period, and African Union principles. Just as other African nations retained their colonial borders upon independence, Eritrea deserved the same recognition. Denying this sovereignty would have been inconsistent, unjust, and potentially destabilizing. So acknowledging historical errors and giving credit where it is due is not a sign of weakness, but a foundation for mutual respect. Both nations can pursue economic, cultural, and security cooperation while respecting Eritrea's sovereignty. Maybe use this as the groundwork for Ethiopia's recognition of Eritrean sovereignty. So as a truth seeker, our conclusion at Ethiopian Hearts for Peace and African Hearts for Peace is, as a neutral truth seeker, I recognize the immense human cost of nearly a century of conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia, including direct and indirect killings during colonial times, annexation and civil war. Some Eritreans tragically sided with colonial powers in conflicts against Ethiopians, which only deepens the suffering. This cycle of violence must end. This essay serves as a foundation for understanding, healing, and moving forward. My stance is one of sympathy and acknowledgement for both nations. I am Abebe Negash, speaking on behalf of Ethiopian Hearts for Peace and African Hearts for Peace. If any Eritrean or Ethiopian wishes to contribute perspectives that I have not covered here, I encourage them to reach out so that the truth can be fully examined and shared for the sake of lasting peace. We discussed immense amount, and we said why Eritrean's sovereignty is a just and territorial exclusivity, ethnic displacement, and the risk of neocolonialism. Territorial exclusivity, ethnic displacement, and the risk of neocolonialism is also here at the doorstep. Beyond legal debates and historical grievances lies a harsher reality on the ground. Systems that treat land as belonging to a single region or ethnic group create second-class humans. That's a reality. When a state or region treats outsiders as guests who own nothing and can be expelled at will, the result is predictable: mass displacement, massacres, and deep social fracture. We have already been this play out in part of Ethiopia, stability in Oromia, and Benishangul Gumuz, where millions have been forced from their homes and communities torn apart. These toxic form of territorial exclusivity creates two tragic outcomes at once. First, it destroys the trust and social fabrics that allow diverse societies to coexist. Second, it opens the door for external exploitation. Fragmented, impoverished communities are far easier to control, and their natural resources become targets for foreign powers and corporations. If Ethiopia were to fracture along ethnic lines, the continent could follow. More than 3,000 ethnic groups would be tempted to seek their own states, and the result would be a patchwork of tiny, weak polities vulnerable to outside control. Eritrea's situation is complicated in a different way. Many young Eritreans flee because life is harsh and opportunities are limited. I'm sorry, I was interrupted, but I don't want to record separately or re-record. Bear with me. This is very important. Okay, just a little bit back. I know it's going to overlap, but this is about territorial exclusivity, ethnic displacement, and the risk of new colonialism. Beyond legal debates and historical grievances lies a harsher reality on the ground. Systems that treat land as belonging to a single region or ethnic group create second-class humans. When a state or region treats outsiders as guests who own nothing and can be expelled at will, the result is predictable, right? Mass displacement, massacre, and deep social fracture. We have already seen this play out in parts of Ethiopia, notably in Oromia and Benishangul Gumuz, where millions of Amharas and Orthodox Christians have been displaced. Included in there are non-Oromos, all from their homes and communities torn apart. This toxic form of territorial exclusivity, as written in the Constitution, creates two tragic outcomes at once. First, it destroys the trust and social fabric that allow diverse societies to coexist. That's exactly why the Eritreans are saying, solve your own diversity problem at home. Second, it opens the door for external exploitation. Look, IMF, World Bank, petrodollars from rich Gulf states, and so forth, are exploiting. So external exploitation, fragmented, impoverished communities are far easier to control, and their natural resources become targets for foreign powers and corporations. We've seen this in Tigray. When it is in a mess, illegal gold mining created a massive poisoning due to the chemical they used, cyanide. If Ethiopia were to fracture along ethnic lines, generally speaking, the continent of Africa could follow. More than 3,000 ethnic groups would be tempted to seek their own states, and the result would be a patchwork of tiny, weak polities vulnerable to outside control. Eritrea's situation is complicated in a different way. Many young Eritreans flee because life is harsh and opportunities are limited. Remember, Ethiopia was cooperating with outside foreign powers to put pressure on Eritrea too. Some remain because they value sovereignty and belonging, no matter how difficult the condition is. The country Eritrea have been put in isolation. That's a fact too. So both reactions are human and understandable. The core problem is the political economy. When land, wealth, and power are concentrated or treated as spoils, people suffer and loyalties fracture. The global context makes this dangerous. The United Nations and many international institutions have weakened and face competing geopolitical pressure. External powers from the Gulf, Europe, China, and others are actively seeking resources and strategic footholds in Africa. Without wise, united leadership, the continent risks a new scramble for resources that looks a lot like colonialism by other means. So, I have more provocative questions for leaders and citizens. What kind of political system protects minority rights while preserving workable sovereign boundaries? How can land rights be reformed so people feel secure in their homes, not disposable under shifting politics? Who will protect communities from forced displacement and exploitation when states treat land as a commodity for sale, not owned by the people, but by the state? If youth are fleeing Eritrea and other countries, and Ethiopians and Somalis, what does that say about the legitimacy of the institutions that they claim to serve them? Can Africans build regional systems that block external resources predation while allowing local self-determination and development? So I call for great minds and collective will in this. This is not a problem that can be solved by rhetoric or force or just me talking this much. It requires careful institutional design, courageous leadership, and inclusive immigration. We need assemblies of jurists, economists, social scientists, elders, youth, and civil society. People who can draft practical frameworks that protect land rights, human dignity, and shared prosperity. We must also recognize that the cost of inaction is high. Continued fragmentation will only worsen poverty, fuel conflict, and hand control of our resources to outside powers. The moral and practical imperative is clear. Africans must build solutions that preserve both human dignity and national viability. If you are an Eritrean, Ethiopian, African, or global friend who wants to add a perspective, a case study, or a practical proposal, please reach out. This essay is a living document intended to invite dialogue, correction, and real proposal for change. Again, my name is Abebe Negash, Ethiopian Hearts for Peace, African Hearts for Peace. In case you are wondering, I am Ethiopian, but my brothers in Eritrea are my people too. With that, I conclude today's presentation. Please reach out, start a dialogue. Thank you.